You get a notification in your email, a client has asked to work together. But what happens now? Logos are deceptively simple. They're just one shape, right? But what if you can create logos that work like this? Today, I'm taking you through everything you need to know to work as a logo designer. From what makes a good logo, how to create dynamic branding, what to ask in discovery meetings, and how to present your work to a client. Everything is timestamped in the description, so let's get going. First off, what makes a good logo? A good logo gives the right feeling. This is a lot more important than showing what the company actually does. The photography style and website copy and other aspects like that usually make it clear what the company does. So instead, we want the logo to be something that can take on a meaning as the company grows and evolves, so that they don't have to switch out their logo if they change something about their company. To make sure we can achieve that feeling in our logo, we're going to be asking our clients some questions. We're going to be talking about their mission and values and goals for the company. And we're also going to be doing a little bit of brand research. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. The next thing to think about is to make sure that the logos we create feel like they fit into the right industry. So for example, if we're creating a logo for a solar company, we'll want it to look a little bit like other solar companies so that it doesn't feel like a cupcake store or a lawyer, for example. But we still want it to be different enough to stand apart. So finding that balance is something we're going to look at today as well. If we don't look like the right industry, we're going to have to spend so much more money on marketing trying to explain what it is that we do. We also want to make sure the logo mark that we create is easy to remember, and that's why so many logos are very simple. There was a really fun study done by Van Monster where they asked 100 people to draw famous logos from car brands. Some of the results were spot on, but many of them had a little bit of variation in there, so it shows how important it is to keep things simple and memorable. Logos live everywhere, from a giant billboard to your social media profile or maybe embroidered on your shirt. That means that the logos that we create also need to fit in lots of different formats. So we need to create more than one version of our logo. And sometimes this is referred to as a responsive logo design. This might mean creating an icon and a word mark or a monogram, for example. So we're going to have a look at how to think about this as well. Logos also need to work in different colors. So you usually have your black and your white version, and then you might have at least one other version in the brand color. But we also want to think about the different combinations that are going to work. We want to think about accessibility. So that's really important for making sure that your logo is going to work long term. Light objects tend to look a little bit bigger than dark objects. So when you design your logo, you also want to think about how they actually look and if you want to tweak the version that is white compared to the version that is black or in a dark color. So you might want to add a little bit more white space to your white logo to give the same impression. A good way to test this out is to put them next to each other and squint a little bit and see if they appear the same, and otherwise you can make small tweaks. Another criteria for a good logo that I think a lot of designers actually overlook is to make sure that the client really loves the design. I know that we primarily design for the client's customer, but the client is ultimately the one who's going to be using the brand day to day, promote it, and if they're not excited and passionate about it, chances are they'll start tweaking it and making changes or stop using it altogether. So we also want to make sure that we take into consideration what our client is really passionate about putting out there. Our role as designers is not just to give in to everything, but to give advice, but also listen and then implement those changes so that we get something that everyone feels really good about. Most businesses tweak their logo over time. And when I got started in 2015, it was all the rage to have everything flat design. So you might have noticed that there's been a trend and a shift, first from very complex logos to more minimalist logos, and now we're getting a lot more character back into it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with creating a logo that feels a little bit on trend or following what our culture is looking for right now. But what we want to make sure is that we're putting that through the filter of accessibility, something that's going to be appealing to that client's customers. We still need to fit in all the other criteria that are important for a good logo before we think about the trendy or what's really popular right now. So you get a notification in your email, a client has asked to work together. But what happens now? Before we actually start designing, we need to do a couple things to make life a lot easier for ourselves. First off, I like to have a 15 to 30 minute quick chat over like a virtual call or something like that, where we just want to talk about the budget, the timeline, their expectations for the project, and make sure that we're actually a good fit. If you feel like the lead is maybe not very serious and you don't want to spend time on a call, you could just pre-vet the call by talking about your budget and timeline and seeing if that's a good fit. You can definitely have a form on your website where you ask all these things, but the reason that I like to have that quick call is not only does it build more of a relationship so that they're feeling a little bit more comfortable saying yes, but you can also ask a lot of follow-up questions that help you create a really good and strong proposal that will also be more likely to be accepted. So now that we've had this call and everyone's on board, it's time to create that proposal. The goal of the proposal is to show your process, why you're the best choice, talk about the project timeline and budget, and showcase your portfolio. So we want to make sure that we are really being consistent and clear with our messaging, and that we're really thinking about things that typically come up in a project that could be a little bit difficult or that people might be unsure about how that works, so that we are preemptively avoiding any confusion. I actually made a template for this, so if you don't want to think about what to put in and you just want a template that you can grab and edit yourself, I'll make sure to link that below. Next up is sending an invoice for usually something like 50% as a deposit, and also to send a design contract or agreement. And definitely don't skip these steps. These are super important for making sure that the client is serious about the project and for protecting you throughout the entire design process. A contract does not have to be very complicated. Mine is about 1 page long, and it just talks about who owns the rights to the design and what happens if we disagree or one person wants to stop working together. But it also talks about plagiarism and things like that, just so that we make sure we're on the same page and everyone feels really comfortable. Luckily, I haven't had to go to small claims court in the time that I've been running my business. But what it really has done is help me avoid scope creep a lot of times, because I bring up things like how many sets of revisions that we include in the project budget, and what happens if they change something major. Like one time we had a client who changed their company name midway through a logo design project, and obviously that impacts how much work we have to put in. And we didn't have anything in our contract that said they couldn't do that, so now we do. So as you go along, you can update your contract with things that maybe have been a bit of a hiccup in the past. Send everything off for a digital signature, and now we can set up our project home base. I like to use Trello for this, but programs like Notion, Basecamp, Asana, everything is really good. It just depends on your personal preferences and how you like to visually see things and organize things. The reason we want to have one of these is because we don't want lots of different things ending up in emails and then we're trying to look for them weeks later. We want everything to be neatly organized in one place, because your client might want to send you inspiration photos, you might be asking them for feedback on things, and so we want to just have everything in one place. And not only is this helpful for you, keeping things and discussions organized, but it also helps your client get an overview of the entire process, so they never have to wonder or feel insecure about what happens next. You can just create a template for this, and then for every new project, you just copy that template and edit some of the details and upload the invoice and contract, for example. I also like to add the proposal here, just so that if they're ever unsure about what we decided and with the timelines or anything else, they can just have a look there and everything is already laid out for them. Like I mentioned, I use Trello, and so I have one column for each stage of the design process, and then I just add cards for each either deliverable or different things that we need to have, like different meetings or different discussions. Most of these project management platforms let you copy a link, and that way you can send a little bit of an introductory welcome email to your client explaining that they're going to be clicking this link to join the board or join the program that you have, and why you're setting this up, and basically the next steps. Okay, that was a lot of groundwork, but I promise it will pay off. Being a little bit structured like this, it's gonna save you tons of time for the rest of the project. And it also makes sure that clients are really happy and feeling secure throughout, so they're more likely to come back for other work or refer someone. Now it's time to meet up with our client for a 1 to 2 hour meeting as a discovery session. And this is something where I'm really wanting to get into their values and their customers, really understand who their customers are, how they want to be seen, how this logo is going to be used, so we know all the different applications and use cases we're designing for, learning about the competition and how they're different, and also just hearing their story and building that rapport with the client is really important. I use a tool called Brief, and here you can actually share your screen and then set up these questions beforehand so that you can fill it out together. And I find that that is a lot more interactive, and the client can really see the progress going through it, rather than sitting for 1 to 2 hours just having a conversation, because I feel like the energy usually drops a little bit kind of in the middle. And what I also do is tend to have a little mini break for everyone to just go grab another cup of coffee or go to the bathroom, for example. Make sure that you talk to your client about why you're having this meeting and do mostly listening. I think like talking here is very strategic. We're asking questions and follow-up questions, but the client is going to do most of the talking. We want to wrap up this meeting by setting really specific, clear goals that we can actually measure for the logo project. So instead of just saying, oh, I want a new logo, we want to talk about, oh, I want it to appeal to a younger audience, or I want the logo to be flexible in more formats, or whatever the goal for that project is. This means that when we're doing research and creating mood boards and everything, we can actually come back to these goals and think, is this actually fulfilling that goal that we were talking about? This kind of takes away a lot of the personal preferences, and instead we focus on what is going to work practically for the company. If you want an exact list of every question that I ask in a discovery meeting, I actually made a template for this too, so I'll make sure to add a link to that down in the description. So it's time to start designing, kind of. It's research time. I like to break my research into visual research and psychographics. We're going to start with psychographics because they're the ones that are going to affect what we're looking for in the visual research. Psychographics are kind of like personas, but instead of focusing on details like age and where they live, we're focusing on what they care about. What goes through their head when they're making a decision about this type of purchase. Like, for example, maybe the customer is someone who's really trying to save money, or who cares about buying ethical, sustainable products, or maybe someone who really cares about luxury, for example. We also want to focus on how they want to be seen by others. So, for example, a fashion brand that is selling to artists and creatives might have bold prints and lots of color, because artists are expressing their creativity through their fashion. But if it's a fashion designer working with lawyers, for example, we might want something that feels very professional and minimalist. Knowing these different values that this customer cares about, we can try to reflect that through the logo design that we create. So, how do we actually find answers to these questions? I think comment sections are actually a treasure trove of answers. Not only for your own client's business, but you can go to their competitors and look at what people really like, what they're really frustrated about, and this is really going to reveal the things that they care about. For example, let's say people are really frustrated that they just can't get an actual human when they ask for support, and you know that your client has a really good actual personable support system for people who ask questions. In that case, that's something that you can highlight and show this overall helpful human approach in your branding and logo design. At this stage, grab all the links for interesting things that you find, pull different quotes, and compile it in one place so that we can then come back to that and reference it when we're looking at mood board design. I like to use Milanote for this because it just keeps everything organized, and I can quickly add links and different boards to organize all of my different ideas. I also like to have a little idea section just because as you're looking at things, you kind of have things that pop up as ideas. So I like to be able to put them there so I don't forget about them. And so now we can move on to the mood board stage. Here we want to find a couple different directions that all are solving for those specific goals that our client brought up, but are distinct enough to not be able to be confused with each other. I like to use the Milanote extension to just save images from wherever I find them on the web to my Milanote board, and then I can go in there and organize them into the different categories. So what should you include in a mood board? If I'm designing a logo and not a full brand, I still want to include mock-ups and things that are going to help the client actually envision how that logo is going to work day to day. It can also be a good idea to include the color palette shown, for example, on the side, just so that we're really cementing the difference between the different mood boards that we're showing. This is also going to make it so much easier for you when you start designing to be able to have that really consistent direction. Don't be afraid to customize things that you find. If you want to tweak the color, the layout, if you want to update the font, for example, make those changes if you want, just to get that perfect clear direction, because that little bit of time that you're investing now, it's going to save you tons of time later on when you have to think about what decisions to make. I suggest showing 3 mood boards to the client because that way I can have one that's basically exactly what they asked for, One that's maybe pushing a little bit of new interesting directions, and one that is more of a wild card. And that is usually something that the client hasn't really thought about or asked about, but in my research I find a direction that I think, oh, this could be really interesting, and showing them this as a mood board stage, it could either be an easy no and then they can move on to decide between the other two, or it could be something really interesting that shows your value as a creative partner that really brings up new and interesting perspectives. And lastly, for the mood board, make sure that what you're adding is really purposefully connecting to those goals that the client set earlier. In addition to the mood board, I usually also do for the visual research a bit of looking into trends and recent rebrands in their space, because those companies have also done their research and figured out what works for their customers, and if they have the same audience, those recent rebrands are going to give a really good insight into what those people care about. As I'm doing this research, I continue to fill up my Mila noteboard with links and other thoughts that I have along the way, and this is going to make it really easy for me to now put together a little research presentation. I really suggest creating a template for this with the sections that work for your logo projects, so you don't have to keep imagining up what to put every single time. I like to start off by reiterating the goals of the project, talking about what we're trying to achieve, and then diving into the psychographics, followed by the visual trends and research, and then finally the mood boards. When we're talking about mood boards, we want to try to avoid very open questions like, what do you think? And instead we want to focus on how is this mood board, or which of these mood boards is going to achieve those goals best. I think at this point it's okay for your client to pick and choose between different mood boards as long as you're creating more than one concept. If you're someone who creates one concept, make sure they pick one mood board. Otherwise, that might be a little bit confusing. Just make sure that you are really clear and following up with why they like or dislike certain things, rather than just saying yay or nay to different things, because they might love a picture overall, but not like the color, and then generally say they don't like it. So make sure in the meeting you're really present and talking about why and why not they like things. So with all this information in our back pocket, I hope it feels a little bit easier to start designing, because we have so much information about the different directions we're going to explore. I typically like to think about the different concepts that I'm going to develop in terms of the idea, so the concept behind the logo, rather than just thinking about the aesthetic. So for example, for this client, they are someone who helps women over 50 feel more flexible and just happier in their bodies. And so I knew I wanted this sense of flow in the logo. It's a good thing here to have a lot more ideas than you want to end up with in the end, because lots of them just won't work out. So for example, in this project where we worked with a company that helps with inclusive coaching, I had this idea that I was so attached to, that was all about how I would have something that goes from blurry to clear or sharp. Because I had this idea of how inclusion is something that is usually not noticed by people who are not being excluded, and how this coaching is going to help reveal those things. And it was just really, really difficult once I started trying to actually do it, to not make it feel too messy or complicated, how to make it work in different colors. Maybe I'll come back to this idea at some point, but sometimes being a graphic designer and a logo designer, one of your best skills is know how to let go of an idea. So at this point, when you're thinking about concepts and directions, write them all down, because some of them, even if they seem like a great idea, might not fully work out. With all these concepts written down, now we're getting into the sketching phase. And I try to just take away the pressure, because at this point, at least for me, it is really easy to fall into this you just want to squeeze out the good idea and make sure that you're getting it down on paper, and you want to skip to the point where you can start creating, the different applications and lockups and things. But this stage has to take time, so give yourself at least a couple days for sketching, just so you can take a break, maybe go for a walk, do something else, work on a different project, and then come back, because otherwise we're gonna get stuck. Explore as many different directions and concepts as you can, because our first ideas are usually not our best ones. And this is why taking in other inspiration is really important. For the company name, sometimes it's a good idea to go very minimal and just find that perfect font, and then customize the kerning, for example, and maybe work on little changes. But you can also use the pen tool and the pencil tool, for example, to make more substantial customizations to the type. If you start making customizations, it is really easy to start getting carried away because it's really fun and you see how the logo is coming together, but we want to make sure we're also editing ourselves here. We want to make sure we're not cluttering or creating maybe confusion or legibility issues in our logo. So make sure that you keep stepping back and thinking, if I take this away, will it ruin the idea or the concept? Or if I add this, will it actually help? Or is it just something that feels really fun to do, for example? Keep looking at your marks and see that they're balanced. So making sure that it's not lopsided, if that makes sense. So one side has a lot more design or bigger areas. We want to make sure that the mark feels really consistent. It's going to look good in the applications. If you're feeling unsure if your design is going to work, try putting it on a mock-up and seeing, is that going to look good? Is there something that feels a bit off? Look at the spacing between each letter and see if you're squinting again, like we talked about with the white or dark ones, for example. Is there anywhere that seems like it's too tight or where you have a lot of space? Is there something you can do to customize the letters or add in something else or work on the kerning so that you can actually make that space come together and feel balanced? When we're creating icons like monograms or a pictorial mark, for example, we want to make sure that it's going to work for the actual applications, which is usually in a circle. So like for a profile picture, for example. So what I like to do when I'm looking for balance in my icons is to make sure they work really well in a circle. So try that out and see if there's anything that will make it really difficult to have in a circle and if you can tweak that. Let this process take time because, again, we need to be able to step away and get more inspiration and tweak things and really revise. So for me, it typically is about 2 to 4 weeks for this logo sketching stage, depending on how complex the project is and how much other branding elements I'm bringing into it. When you have the sketches that you feel really happy about, start moving into a program like Adobe Illustrator or Figma, for example. It doesn't really matter which tool you use as long as it's creating a vector file. So a vector file means that it can scale to any size without looking pixelated, which is different to something like a raster file which you create on Photoshop, for example, or Procreate, because these are not going to scale nicely. So if your client needs to put it on a billboard and you create it at a size of an A4 page, that doesn't work. But if you work in Adobe Illustrator or Figma where you have that vector file, you can make it any size. I always work in Adobe Illustrator, so I thought I would share some of the tips and tools that I always use for basically every logo design project. First, let's have a look at type. We have the characters panel that gives you a nice overview to customize your text. You can change the kerning and fonts and even the width of the letters. On the side panel, you also have this tool called the Type Touch tool. It lets you select individual letters and you can resize them or rotate them, for example, but still keeping the text editable. If you want to make bigger changes, expand the text so it becomes a shape, but always keep a copy so you can see what font you used. I've definitely made this mistake more than once. We can use the pen tool to make any changes we want to the design. These little dots are called anchor points, and we want to try and have as few of these as we can while still making our design look the way we want. A good idea for logo design can be to try to keep the handles we see here when we hold down and pull away as close to straight or 90 degrees as we can. If we have a lot of anchor points, we can start to see little kinks in the design, so we want to keep as few as possible. Another tool that works in a similar way is the pencil tool. Just like you hear from the name, it works like a pencil, so you can draw shapes that you want to add. And to get a good result, we usually want to tweak the settings to a very smooth finish, but you can play around with this as well. You can also use the shape builder tool to add common shapes. One feature that I really like here is the star one, because if you click to open the settings, you can customize how many points you want to add and how pointy those points should be. A last tool I think you will find really helpful is the radial tool. If you create a shape and go Object, Repeat, and then choose Radial, you'll get this really nice symmetrical shape, and you can choose how many times you want to repeat that shape by dragging these little arrows up and down. Once you have a design you like, you can join all of these different elements by expanding any lines and then selecting all and choose this setting in the Pathfinder. The Pathfinder is one of the tools I use the most because you can add shapes together or subtract them, which is great when you're finalizing your logo for the client, or you just want to add a more unique shape. With your design ready, it's now time to start looking at different lockups. So we touched a little bit on this in the beginning when we talked about what makes a really good logo, and we talked about responsive logos. So here we want to have different versions that are going to work for vertical or horizontal formats, or an icon, for example. To make it really easy for me to come back to make changes, for example, after I get feedback from the client, I like to set up each concept on its own file basically, and then set up different artboards for the different lockups. You can add a new artboard by clicking this little icon in the panel and then dragging it out to the size you want, or you can specify the size in these fields up at the top. We want to make sure we really think about hierarchy when we're creating these different lockups. We don't want the icon to overpower the word mark or for the icon to disappear when we're looking at everything together. So make sure you think about how everything is balanced, and maybe, for example, the word mark is a little bit more important than the slogan. If you want to make sure, for example, that your icon and your word mark are perfectly stacked in a nice line, you can use the Align tool for that. With all of our lockups ready, we can now start adding color. We always want to have different versions of our logo to make it really flexible for their final use. If we decide to have more than one brand color, I always like to specify to the client exactly which color combinations are going to work, because some might not be visible enough, might be very low contrast, for example, or might just not look very good. So we want to make sure we explore the different combinations and which ones are appropriate. To see if the contrast is good enough, you can use a contrast checker like this one. So I'll make sure to link it down in the description if you want to go check it out. If you're designing a full visual identity, this is a great point to start adding photography styles and illustrations, for example, icon design. So try to start expanding the visual language if that's something that you've been hired to do. If not, you can still think about how your logo is going to work practically, like on, for example, the top of a website or on a social media profile, because this is going to make sure not only that our logo is practically going to work, so we're basically vetting it before we're showing it to the client, but it will also be easier for you when you're putting together some mock-ups that you can share when you're presenting your concepts. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to show these concepts to a client and make sure we get really helpful feedback. If we just show the logo in black and white at this stage, it's going to be really difficult for the client to imagine how it's going to work, because not everyone is a visual thinker like us designers. Just like we did when we presented the mood boards, I tend to start with reiterating the goals again. Then I show the logo in the most simple way, so like black and white with the different lockups. And then I start going into applications like social media, website, if they have packaging, for example. You don't have to fully design these if that's not something you've been hired to do, because we don't want to have scope creep that way. But you can still use a nice mock-up and showcase how it could work, just so that they can get a good idea for how flexible this mark is, and it really shows your value as a creative partner. If you're presenting more than one concept, make sure that you're showing it in the same way so they can actually compare apples to apples. If we start showing lots of different mock-ups for each concept, it might get a little bit confusing if they like the mock-up or if they like the logo. The goal for this meeting is for them to pick one concept and then give you any feedback for what to do before we move forward. Back at your desk after this meeting, try to think about the purpose of the different feedback. So sometimes the feedback is very specific, like, oh, I think that the spacing needs to be different here, or I think this color should be a little bit more in this direction. But sometimes the feedback is a little bit more abstract. Maybe they thought the design looked a little bit too young, for example, and we want to see how we can actually create something that feels a little bit more grown up. And these things can be a little bit trickier to interpret. What I like to do when I have this more abstract feedback is to go back to my inspiration boards and try to see if there's any part of it that feels a little bit more young, for example, and that we can maybe pick away. We can also go and look for additional inspiration that we can add that might have a little bit more of a grown-up feel, and then we can incorporate it that way. So don't be afraid to do a little bit more research again before you dive into doing the iterations. Once the client is happy with the design, we can wrap up the project and share a handoff package with them. The handoff package is a great way to not only let your client always have access to their files in an easy way, but also to promote different ways you can continue to work together. I like to add a link so they can add a review on Google, for example, but also to add a little mini proposal at the end where I talk about the services that they might be interested in. In terms of the files, I like to add them all to a cloud storage like Dropbox or Google Drive, for example, and then have a link that I can add into that handoff package so they can always access them. But how do you actually export those files in the best way? Since we already have our file set up with the different artboards for the different lockups, we can make sure we have all the color combinations included, and then we can export them in different formats. For day-to-day use, I typically include a PNG file with a transparent background because that's going to work for lots of different designs that they're creating. You can also include an SVG version if that's something that your client is interested in for a smaller file format on the website, for example. I also like to include an Adobe Illustrator file just so that they have everything they need if they need to make changes, because this is their branding, so they need to be able to have access to it. I usually keep the logo about 500 pixels for the widest side, but if I know that they have applications that are going to be much bigger, I sometimes create an additional version specifically for that. I also like to create a favicon and also a social media icon specifically, because it's going to need to have padding on the sides to look really good for that cropping in that circle. We talked about a lot of minimalist marks in this video, but don't be afraid to explore lots of different directions. The goal is to create logos that give you a feeling, that right emotion. So experiment and have fun with it. If you want to learn how to present your logos in a beautiful portfolio after this, you can look at this video next. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your logo projects and see you next time.